Jake hunched over a dumpster in a narrow alley, his weathered hands sifting through discarded food containers and crumpled papers. The stench of rotting garbage filled his nostrils, but he was too focused on finding his next meal to care. His threadbare coat offered little protection against the biting wind that whistled through the urban canyon. As he dug deeper into the trash, Jake felt the familiar sting of society's indifference. Passers-by quickened their pace as they walked by the alley, averting their eyes from the disheveled man knee-deep in refuse. Jake had long since grown accustomed to this treatment, but it didn't make it hurt any less. His fingers brushed against something different, a paper envelope, yellowed with age and torn at one corner. Jake pulled it out, wiping away a smear of grease to reveal his name scrawled in faded ink. Curiosity piqued, he carefully opened the envelope and extracted a letter. Jake squinted at the cramped handwriting, struggling to make out the words in the dim light of the alley. He moved closer to the street, using the glow from a nearby storefront to illuminate the page. As he read, his eyes widened in disbelief. The letter informed Jake that he had inherited a substantial fortune from a distant uncle he'd never met. The news hit him like a physical blow, momentarily robbing him of breath. Hope, an emotion he'd almost forgotten, sparked to life in his chest. Jake reread the letter several times, convinced he must be hallucinating or misunderstanding. But the words remained the same, black ink on yellowed paper promising a lifeline out of his current situation. For the first time in years, Jake felt a glimmer of possibility for a better future. With trembling hands, Jake folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket. He left the alley, his search for food forgotten in the wake of this life-altering news. His mind raced with questions and possibilities as he navigated the busy city streets. The next morning, Jake found himself standing outside an imposing office building in the heart of the financial district. He hesitated at the entrance, acutely aware of his shabby appearance and the disapproving glances from well-dressed professionals hurrying past. Gathering his courage, Jake pushed through the revolving door and approached the reception desk. The receptionist's polite smile faltered slightly as she took in his appearance, but she maintained her professional demeanor as Jake explained his situation and presented the letter. After a brief wait, Jake was ushered into a plush office where a middle-aged lawyer in an expensive suit greeted him. The lawyer, introducing himself as Mr. Thompson, invited Jake to sit and began explaining the details of his inheritance. Mr. Thompson's words washed over Jake in a blur of legal jargon and staggering figures. The inheritance, it turned out, was even larger than Jake had initially thought. As Mr. Thompson outlined the various assets, properties, and accounts now in Jake's name, the reality of his changed circumstances began to sink in. Jake listened intently, asking questions when he could find his voice. Mr. Thompson patiently explained the legal processes involved in claiming the inheritance and the responsibilities that came with such wealth. He also touched on the potential lifestyle changes Jake might expect. As the meeting drew to a close, Mr. Thompson handed Jake a thick folder of documents to review and sign. Jake's hand shook slightly as he accepted the papers, the weight of them serving as a tangible reminder of his new reality. Leaving the office, Jake stepped out onto the busy street, the folder clutched tightly to his chest. The world around him seemed unchanged, but Jake knew that everything had shifted. He was no longer invisible, no longer a man to be ignored or pitied. He had resources, options, and a future that just yesterday had seemed impossible. Jake walked aimlessly for hours, his mind grappling with the enormity of the change in his circumstances. The letter in his pocket and the folder in his hands were keys to a new life, but Jake couldn't help feeling overwhelmed by the prospect. Years on the streets had taught him to be wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. As night fell, Jake found himself back in familiar territory, the streets where he had spent so many nights. He looked at the other homeless individuals, huddled in doorways and on benches, seeing his former self reflected in their weary faces. The contrast between his past and potential future struck him forcefully, leaving him with a mix of excitement and trepidation about what lay ahead. Jake stood nervously on the doorstep of a large suburban home, his newly purchased clothes feeling strange and uncomfortable. He hesitated before ringing the doorbell, his hand hovering over the button as doubts flooded his mind. The door swung open before he could make a decision, revealing a middle-aged woman with a plastered-on smile. "Jake, oh, my darling boy," she exclaimed, pulling him into an embrace that felt more rehearsed than genuine. Jake stiffened at the contact, unsure how to respond to this sudden display of affection from the mother who had turned her back on him years ago. As he entered the house, Jake was greeted by a chorus of excited voices and a flurry of movement. Faces he barely recognized from distant memories appeared before him, all wearing expressions of joy that didn't quite reach their eyes. Uncles, aunts, and cousins he hadn't seen in years crowded around, patting his back and shaking his hand as if he'd never left. The forced smiles and overly enthusiastic greetings made Jake's skin crawl. He couldn't help but wonder where all this warmth had been when he was struggling to survive on the streets. The stark contrast between their current behavior and their past indifference was jarring. As Jake was ushered into the living room, his sister Emily appeared. Unlike the others, her approach was more measured, her smile a bit more genuine. She embraced Jake tightly, whispering, "I've missed you, little brother." Emily quickly took charge of the situation, shooing away the hovering relatives and guiding Jake to a quiet corner of the room. She sat beside him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the boy she once knew. "I know this must be overwhelming," Emily said softly, "but we're all so happy you're back. Family is everything, Jake. It's the key to true happiness." Jake nodded non-committally, unsure how to respond. Emily's words sounded rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech. Yet there was a hint of sincerity in her voice that made Jake want to believe her. As the evening progressed, Emily remained by Jake's side, acting as a buffer between him and the rest of the family. She regaled him with stories of what he'd missed, painting a picture of a close-knit family that Jake struggled to recognize. Jake found himself torn between suspicion and hope. Part of him longed to believe that his family truly cared, that they regretted abandoning him. But years on the streets had taught him to be wary of people's motives, especially when money was involved. The conversation inevitably turned to Jake's newfound wealth. Though no one mentioned it directly, there were pointed questions about his plans for the future and subtle suggestions about family businesses that could use investment. Jake deflected these inquiries as best he could, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. As the night wore on, Jake found himself in a luxurious guest room, a stark contrast to the cardboard boxes and park benches he'd called home for so long. The soft bed and plush carpets felt alien to him, a reminder of how far removed he was from his recent past. Jake tossed and turned, unable to sleep despite the comfortable surroundings. Memories of his life on the streets kept intruding, vivid and visceral. The smell of garbage, the biting cold of winter nights, the gnawing pain of hunger. These sensations were still too fresh in his mind to be easily forgotten. In the quiet of the night, Jake's thoughts turned to the people he'd left behind. The other homeless individuals who had become his makeshift family, offering companionship and watching out for each other in a world that had turned its back on them. He felt a pang of guilt at having escaped that life while they remained trapped in it. Morning brought a flurry of activity as the family gathered for breakfast. Jake found himself at the center of attention once again, bombarded with questions about his plans and offers of help that felt more like attempts to influence his decisions. Emily continued to play the role of protector, deflecting the more intrusive questions and steering the conversation to safer topics. But even her presence couldn't completely ease Jake's discomfort. The opulent surroundings and expensive food served as constant reminders of the vast gulf between his past and present. As Jake navigated this unfamiliar terrain of family dynamics and wealth, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outsider looking in. The smiles, the laughter, the casual displays of affection all seemed to belong to a world he no longer understood. Jake excused himself from the table, needing a moment alone to clear his head. He stepped out onto the back porch, taking in the manicured lawn and carefully tended flower beds. The peaceful scene before him was a far cry from the gritty reality he'd known for so long. As he stood there, trying to reconcile his past with his present, Jake realized that his journey was far from over. The inheritance had changed his circumstances, but the real challenge lay in figuring out who he was and where he belonged in this new world. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with both opportunity and potential pitfalls. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever might come next. Jake was sitting in the living room of his family's house, feeling out of place among the expensive furnishings, when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't familiar, but he answered anyway, grateful for any distraction. "Jake, is that really you?" a voice from the past asked. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the speaker. "Carlos, how did you find me?" Carlos laughed, a warm, familiar sound that immediately put Jake at ease. "News travels fast, my friend, especially when it involves a long-lost buddy suddenly coming into a fortune. Listen, I'm in town. How about we grab a coffee and catch up?" Jake agreed without hesitation, relieved at the prospect of seeing a familiar face that wasn't tied to his estranged family. He made his excuses to Emily, who frowned but didn't object, and headed out to meet Carlos at a nearby cafe. As Jake approached the cafe, he spotted Carlos immediately. His old friend hadn't changed much, still sporting the same easy smile and relaxed demeanor that Jake remembered from their childhood. Carlos stood up and embraced Jake warmly, a genuine gesture that contrasted sharply with the forced affection of Jake's family reunion. They settled into a quiet corner of the cafe, steaming cups of coffee in front of them. For a moment, neither spoke, each taking in the changes time had wrought on the other. Then Carlos broke the silence. "It's good to see you, Jake. Really good. I've wondered about you over the years, you know. Tried to find you a few times, but..." He trailed off, leaving unsaid the difficulties of tracking someone living on the streets. Jake nodded, understanding the unspoken words. "It's been a long road, Carlos. But I'm here now. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure where here is anymore." Carlos leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's why I wanted to meet, Jake. I know you've come into some money and I'm happy for you. But I also know what it's like to suddenly have your world turned upside down. I wanted to remind you of who you are, of where you come from. Not the family that abandoned you, but the person you were before all that." As they talked, Jake felt some of the tension he'd been carrying since receiving the inheritance start to ease. Carlos didn't shy away from discussing Jake's time on the streets, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity. They reminisced about their childhood adventures, laughing at shared memories of simpler times. The conversation naturally turned to their experiences with homelessness. Carlos revealed that he too had spent time on the streets after a string of bad luck and poor decisions. He spoke of the hardships he'd faced, the lessons he'd learned, and how he'd eventually managed to turn his life around. "You know," Carlos said thoughtfully, "we could do something about it. Help others who are still out there, struggling like we did." Jake felt a spark of excitement at the idea. "What do you mean?" Carlos leaned in, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "Think about it, Jake. You've got resources now. We've got experience. We could start a program, maybe a shelter or a job training center. Something to give people a real chance at getting back on their feet." The idea took root in Jake's mind, growing and expanding as they discussed possibilities. For the first time since receiving the news of his inheritance, Jake felt a sense of purpose, a direction for his newfound wealth that aligned with his values and experiences. As they were deep in conversation, planning and dreaming, Jake's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it to see multiple messages from Emily, asking where he was and when he'd be back. Jake frowned, suddenly reminded of the world he'd temporarily escaped. Carlos noticed the change in Jake's expression. "Family giving you trouble?" Jake sighed, putting the phone away. "They're adjusting. To be honest, I'm not sure what to make of them. They seem happy I'm back, but there's something off about it all." Carlos nodded understandingly. "It's a tricky situation. Just remember, Jake, you don't owe them anything. Your life is your own now. You get to decide what to do with it." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Jake felt a renewed sense of confidence. Carlos's presence had grounded him, reminding him of who he was beyond the labels of homeless man or wealthy heir. They parted with a promise to meet again soon to further discuss their ideas for helping the homeless community. Jake watched Carlos walk away, feeling grateful for the unexpected reconnection with his old friend. However, as Jake turned to head back to his family's house, he spotted Emily across the street, her expression a mix of concern and disapproval. She quickly crossed over to him. "Jake, where have you been? We've been worried sick," she said, her tone carrying a hint of accusation. Jake gestured towards the cafe. "I was just catching up with an old friend, Emily. Carlos. Remember him?" Emily's frown deepened. "Carlos? From the old neighborhood? Jake, are you sure that's a good idea? You're in a different place now. You need to be careful about who you associate with." Her words stirred a mix of emotions in Jake. Anger at the implied judgment, frustration at the attempt to control his actions, but also a lingering desire for family approval that he couldn't quite shake. As they walked back together, Emily continued to voice her concerns, subtly hinting that Jake should focus on reconnecting with the family rather than revisiting old relationships. Jake listened in silence, the warmth and purpose he'd felt with Carlos slowly giving way to the familiar discomfort of navigating his new family dynamics. Jake realized that he was standing at a crossroads. The path forward wasn't clear, but he knew that the decisions he made now would shape not just his future, but potentially the lives of others as well. With that thought in mind, he steeled himself for the conversations and confrontations that lay ahead. Jake sat in the study of his newly acquired mansion, surrounded by stacks of papers and old documents. He had been poring over the details of his inheritance for days, trying to understand the extent of his newfound wealth and its origins. As he delved deeper into the family history, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Buried within legal documents and old correspondence, Jake uncovered evidence of his family's darker side. There were hints of violence, betrayals, and questionable business practices that stretched back generations. The wealth he had inherited, it seemed, was built on a foundation of secrets and lies. One particular document caught his attention, a yellowed letter from his uncle, the one who had left him the inheritance. In it, his uncle spoke cryptically about protecting the innocent from the family's legacy. Jake's hands trembled as he realized the implications. His uncle had known about the family's misdeeds and had chosen Jake as the recipient of the wealth in an attempt to right past wrongs. As Jake pieced together the family's history, he found records detailing his own abandonment. Cold, clinical notes discussed the decision to cut ties with him, citing concerns about his unsuitability for the family business. The discovery hit Jake like a physical blow, confirming his worst suspicions about his family's true nature. Lost in thought, Jake barely noticed when Emily entered the study. She paused at the door, taking in the scene of scattered papers and Jake's troubled expression. "Jake, what's all this?" Emily asked, her voice laced with forced casualness. Jake looked up, meeting his sister's gaze. "I'm just trying to understand our family better, Emily. There's a lot I didn't know." Emily's eyes darted to the papers on the desk, a flicker of worry crossing her face. "Oh, you don't need to bother with all that old stuff. It's in the past. What matters is that we're together now, right?" Jake watched his sister carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Is it really in the past, Emily? Because from what I've found, it seems like our family's history is still very much alive." Emily's facade cracked slightly, her smile faltering. "What exactly have you found, Jake?" "Enough to know that this family isn't what it pretends to be," Jake replied, his voice steady, despite the turmoil he felt inside. "I know about the violence, the betrayals. I know why I was really abandoned." Emily's expression hardened, the pretense of warmth disappearing entirely. "You don't understand anything, Jake. Our family has done what was necessary to survive and thrive. Sometimes that means making hard choices." "Hard choices?" Jake echoed incredulously. "Is that what you call throwing your brother out onto the streets?" Emily's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and something that looked almost like guilt. "You were a liability, Jake. You weren't cut out for the life we lead. We did what we had to do." The bluntness of her words stung, but Jake refused to back down. "And now that I have money, suddenly I'm family again? How convenient." Emily's demeanor changed, her voice taking on a honeyed tone. "Jake, darling, you're looking at this all wrong. Yes, mistakes were made in the past, but we can move forward now. You're one of us, and together, we can do great things." Jake felt a wave of revulsion at her attempt to manipulate him. "I'm not interested in being one of you, Emily. Not if it means being part of this legacy of cruelty and greed." Emily's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice, Jake. You're a part of this family, whether you like it or not. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be for you." The threat in her words was clear, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that his sister, and likely the rest of the family, viewed his return not as a reconciliation, but as a necessity to protect their interests. As Emily left the study, her parting words lingering in the air like a poisonous cloud, Jake turned back to the documents spread across the desk. He knew he needed help to navigate this treacherous situation. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed Carlos's number. When his friend answered, Jake spoke quickly, his voice low. "Carlos, I need your help. Can you meet me? There's something I need to show you." Carlos agreed without hesitation, sensing the urgency in Jake's tone. They arranged to meet at a quiet park, away from the watchful eyes of Jake's family. As Jake gathered the most damning documents to show Carlos, he felt a mix of fear and determination. He was stepping into dangerous territory, challenging a family that had shown itself capable of ruthless action. But he also felt a sense of purpose. His uncle had chosen him for a reason, and Jake was determined to use his inheritance to expose the truth and break the cycle of corruption that had defined his family for generations. With a final glance around the study, Jake slipped the documents into a folder and prepared to leave. As he walked out of the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The weight of family secrets and unspoken threats hung heavy in the air, but Jake pressed on, knowing that the path to the truth and to his own redemption lay ahead. Jake arrived at the park, clutching the folder of documents tightly to his chest. He spotted Carlos sitting on a bench near a small pond, his posture tense as if sensing the gravity of the situation. As Jake approached, Carlos stood, his face etched with concern. "Jake, what's going on? You sounded pretty shaken up on the phone," Carlos said, his eyes scanning the area as if checking for potential threats. Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "I've discovered something, Carlos. Something big about my family and this inheritance." They sat down, and Jake began to explain what he had found. He showed Carlos the documents, pointing out the evidence of his family's misdeeds and the cryptic letter from his uncle. Carlos listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Your uncle left you this inheritance to protect you from the family?" Carlos asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and admiration. Jake nodded. "It seems that way. He knew what the family was capable of and wanted to give me a chance to break free from their influence." As they pored over the documents together, Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. Having Carlos there, someone he could trust implicitly, made the burden of his discovery feel slightly lighter. Their discussion was interrupted by the buzzing of Jake's phone. It was a message from Emily, demanding to know where he was and insisting he return home immediately. Jake ignored it, focusing instead on formulating a plan with Carlos. "We need to be careful, Jake," Carlos warned. "If your family is as dangerous as these documents suggest, they're not going to take kindly to you digging into their past." Jake nodded grimly. "I know, but I can't just sit back and do nothing. Not now that I know the truth." They spent the next few hours strategizing, discussing ways to protect the evidence and potentially expose the family's wrongdoings. As the sun began to set, they agreed to meet again soon and parted ways, each feeling the weight of the task ahead. When Jake returned to the mansion, he found Emily waiting for him in the foyer, her arms crossed and her expression thunderous. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "And don't lie to me, Jake. I know you've been meeting with that Carlos person again." Jake met her gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "My whereabouts are my own business, Emily. I don't answer to you or anyone else in this family." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game, little brother. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "I think I have a pretty good idea," Jake retorted. "I know about the family's past, Emily. I know what our parents, what you have done." For a moment, Emily's mask slipped, and Jake saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold determination. "You don't understand anything, Jake. Everything we've done has been for the good of the family." "The good of the family?" Jake scoffed. "How is abandoning your own brother for the good of the family?" Emily's voice took on a pleading tone. "We did what we had to do, Jake. You weren't cut out for this life. We were protecting you." Jake laughed bitterly. "Protecting me? By throwing me out on the streets? That's a strange kind of protection, Emily. You don't understand the pressures we were under." Emily insisted. "But things can be different now. You're one of us again. We can start over. Be a real family." Jake studied his sister's face, searching for any sign of genuine emotion. But all he saw was calculation, a desperate attempt to maintain control over him and the family's wealth. "I'm not interested in being part of this family, Emily," Jake said firmly. "Not if it means compromising my principles or turning a blind eye to what you've done." Emily's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice, Jake. You're a part of this whether you like it or not. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be for you." The threat in her words was clear, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that his sister, and likely the rest of the family, viewed his return not as a reconciliation, but as a necessity to protect their interests. As Emily turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Think carefully about your next move, Jake. Family is forever, but only if you play by the rules." Left alone in the foyer, Jake felt the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He knew that he was at a crossroads. On one side lay the path of least resistance, accepting his place in the family and enjoying the wealth and privilege that came with it. On the other was a more difficult road, one that might lead to conflict and danger, but also to the truth and a chance at redemption. Jake's hand went to his pocket, where he had safely tucked away the most damning evidence he had found. He thought of Carlos, of the plans they had made, and of the people they could help if they played this right. With a deep breath, Jake made his decision. He wouldn't be intimidated or bought off. He would use his inheritance the way his uncle had intended, to break the cycle of corruption and make things right. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jake was ready to face them. The real fight was just beginning. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Carlos threw themselves into establishing a small organization aimed at helping the homeless. They rented a modest office space in a part of town far from Jake's family's influence and began reaching out to local shelters and community centers. Jake's experiences on the streets proved invaluable as they developed their programs. They focused on providing not just immediate assistance, but also long-term support to help people rebuild their lives. Job training workshops, mental health counseling, and housing assistance quickly became the cornerstones of their operation. As word spread about their work, Jake and Carlos found themselves becoming known figures in the community. They organized fundraising events, leveraging Jake's newfound status to attract donors and raise awareness about homelessness in the city. One evening, as they were wrapping up after a particularly successful event, Jake felt a surge of pride. "You know, Carlos," he said, "for the first time since I got this inheritance, I feel like I'm doing something worthwhile." Carlos clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "We're making a real difference, Jake. This is what it's all about." Their moment of celebration was interrupted by the buzz of Jake's phone. It was a message from Emily, demanding to know why he hadn't attended a family dinner that evening. Jake had completely forgotten about it, caught up in the excitement of their event. He showed the message to Carlos, his expression darkening. "They're not going to let this go, are they?" Carlos shook his head grimly. "Doesn't look like it. Have you thought about what you're going to do?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't keep avoiding them forever, but I'm not going to let them dictate my life either." The next day, Jake reluctantly returned to the family mansion. As soon as he walked in, he could feel the tension in the air. Emily was waiting for him in the living room, her posture rigid and her eyes cold. "So, you've decided to grace us with your presence," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope whatever you were doing was worth neglecting your family obligations." Jake met her gaze steadily. "I was at a fundraising event for our organization. We're helping people who are struggling, Emily. People like I used to be." Emily's lip curled in disgust. "Playing charity worker now, are we? You're wasting your time and resources on lost causes, Jake. That money could be invested in the family business, expanding our influence." "That lost cause used to be me, remember?" Jake shot back. "Or have you conveniently forgotten that you and the rest of the family threw me out on the streets?" Emily's eyes flashed dangerously. "We did what was necessary, and now you're throwing away the second chance we've given you." Jake laughed bitterly. "Second chance? You only came looking for me when you found out about the inheritance. Don't pretend this is about family, Emily. It's about control." For a moment, Emily's mask slipped, and Jake saw a flicker of something, regret, fear, in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a cold determination. "You're playing a dangerous game, Jake," she warned. "The family won't stand for this much longer. You need to fall in line." Jake stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "Or what, Emily? You'll throw me out again? Go ahead. I've survived it once. I can do it again." Emily's voice lowered to a menacing whisper. "There are worse things than being thrown out, Jake. Much worse. Don't push us." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he refused to show fear. "Is that how it's going to be? Threats and intimidation? Some family?" Emily's expression softened slightly, though Jake could still see the calculation behind her eyes. "It doesn't have to be this way, Jake. We could work together. Your experiences could be valuable to the family business. Think of the good we could do with our combined resources." For a brief moment, Jake was tempted. The idea of reconciliation, of being part of a family again, tugged at a deep, lonely part of him. But then he thought of the documents he'd uncovered. the evidence of the family's corrupt dealings, and his resolve hardened. "I'm already doing good, Emily," he said firmly. "Real good, helping people who need it. I won't compromise that for the family's idea of business." Emily's face hardened again. "You're making a mistake, Jake, a big one. I hope you're prepared for the consequences." As Jake left the mansion, he felt a mix of emotions churning inside him. Fear at Emily's thinly veiled threats, anger at the family's attempts to control him, but also a renewed determination to continue on the path he'd chosen. He pulled out his phone and dialed Carlos's number. "Hey," he said when his friend answered, "we need to be careful. Things with the family are escalating. I think they might try something." Carlos's voice was grim but resolute. "We knew this might happen, Jake. We'll be ready. Whatever comes, we're in this together." As Jake hung up, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, possibly even dangerous. But for the first time in his life, he was standing up for what he believed in, making a real difference in people's lives. Whatever the family threw at him, he was ready to face it. The real fight was just beginning. The tension between Jake and his family continued to escalate over the following weeks. He threw himself into his work with the homeless organization, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that followed him everywhere. One night, as Jake was leaving the office late, he noticed a group of men loitering near his car. Their stance was casual, but there was something about their watchful gazes that set off alarm bells in Jake's mind. He slowed his pace, hand tightening on his keys. As he approached, one of the men stepped forward. "You Jake? The new millionaire with a conscience?" Jake's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "Who's asking?" The man's lips curled into a sneering smile. "Just some concerned citizens. We hear you've been making waves, stirring up trouble for some important people." Jake's mind raced. Were these men sent by his family? Or were they connected to someone else his family had wronged? Either way, he knew he was in danger. "I'm just trying to help people," Jake said, slowly backing away. "I'm not looking for trouble." The leader of the group laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down Jake's spine. "Trouble's found you anyway, rich boy. Time to learn your place." Just as the situation was about to turn violent, a car horn blared, headlights flooding the area. Jake recognized Carlos's voice shouting his name. The distraction was enough for Jake to make a run for it, diving into Carlos's car as his friend peeled away from the curb. "What the hell was that?" Carlos demanded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as the adrenaline coursed through his system. I think my family's making their move," Carlos cursed under his breath. "We need to be more careful, Jake. This isn't a game anymore." As they drove through the night, Jake's mind whirled with the implications of what had just happened. His family's threats weren't empty after all. They were willing to resort to violence to keep him in line. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carlos's expression was grim but determined. "We fight back. We've got evidence of their corruption, right? Maybe it's time we use it." Jake nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "You're right. We can't let them intimidate us into silence. It's time to take a stand." The next day, Jake decided it was time for a final confrontation with his family. He arranged a dinner at an upscale restaurant, neutral ground where he hoped the public setting would discourage any overt threats or violence. As Jake entered the private dining room, he saw his family already seated around the table. Emily, his parents, and a few key uncles and aunts, all the major players in the family's shadowy empire. Their faces were masks of polite interest, but Jake could sense the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Jake, darling," his mother cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How lovely of you to arrange this little gathering." Jake took his seat at the head of the table, steeling himself for what was to come. I thought it was time we had an honest conversation about the future of this family." His father's eyebrows rose. "Oh? And what future might that be?" Jake took a deep breath, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it on the table, watching as recognition and then fear flickered across several faces. "I know everything," Jake said, his voice steady. "The fraud, the violence, the betrayals, all of it. And I have proof." Emily's face paled. "Jake, what are you doing?" "What I should have done from the beginning," Jake replied. "I'm putting an end to this cycle of corruption and greed." He opened the folder, spreading out documents that detailed years of the family's illicit activities. Bank statements showing money laundering, contracts for illegal business deals, even evidence linking the family to several unsolved crimes. The room erupted into chaos. His father lunged for the documents, while his uncles shouted denials and threats. Emily sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock and something that looked almost like relief. "Enough!" Jake's voice cut through the din. "This ends now. Either you all agree to dismantle this criminal empire and make amends, or these documents go to the authorities." His mother's laugh was brittle and sharp. "You wouldn't dare. You're one of us, Jake. This would destroy you too." Jake met her gaze steadily. "I'm prepared for that. Are you?" The standoff at the restaurant lasted for hours. Threats were made, then bargains, then pleas. Jake stood firm, laying out his conditions for keeping the evidence from the police. As dawn broke, a tentative agreement was reached. The family would gradually divest from their illegal operations, using their resources instead to fund legitimate businesses and charitable causes. Jake would oversee the transition, ensuring that restitution was made where possible. Emily, looking shell-shocked but somehow lighter, was the first to officially agree. "It's time," she said softly. "We've lived under this shadow for too long." One by one, the other family members fell in line, some grudgingly, some with visible relief at the chance for redemption. Jake's father was the last holdout, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he snarled at Jake. "You have no idea what you're destroying." Jake stood his ground. "I know exactly what I'm destroying and what I'm building in its place." As the family filed out of the restaurant, Jake felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had done it. He had faced down his family and won, but he knew the real work was just beginning. Outside, he found Carlos waiting, having kept watch through the night. "How did it go?" his friend asked anxiously. Jake managed a tired smile. "It's over. Or maybe it's just starting. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Carlos clapped him on the shoulder. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As they walked away from the restaurant, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and potential pitfalls. But for the first time since receiving his inheritance, he felt truly free. Free to use his resources for good. Free from the shadow of his family's crimes. Free to build the life and legacy he chose for himself. The sun was rising over the city, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. To Jake, it felt like a new beginning, not just for him, but for all the lives he now had the power to touch and improve. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it head-on. In the weeks following the confrontation with his family, Jake found himself navigating a complex new reality. The process of dismantling the family's criminal enterprises and redirecting their resources was fraught with challenges. Some family members cooperated grudgingly, while others seemed genuinely eager for a fresh start. Emily, surprisingly, became one of Jake's strongest allies in this transition. One evening, as they worked late in the family office, she finally opened up to him. "I always wanted out, you know," she said quietly, not meeting Jake's eyes. "But I never had the courage to stand up to them like you did." Jake studied his sister, seeing her vulnerability for the first time. "It's not too late to make things right, Emily." She nodded, a determined look settling on her face. "I know, and I want to help. Really help this time." As the family's legitimate businesses were restructured and their illicit operations shut down, Jake found himself facing a crucial decision. The family wealth, now cleansed of its criminal origins, was at his disposal. The question was, what to do with it? The answer came to him during a visit to the homeless shelter where he and Carlos had started their work. As Jake walked through the facility, seeing the faces of people struggling to rebuild their lives, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Over the next few months, Jake worked tirelessly to expand their original organization into a comprehensive support network for the homeless and underprivileged. He used a significant portion of his inheritance to fund job training programs, affordable housing initiatives, and mental health services. Carlos, ever at his side, marveled at the scope of their work. "You know, when we started this, I never imagined it would grow so big," he said one day, as they toured a newly opened job training center. Jake smiled, feeling a sense of purpose that he'd never experienced before. "Neither did I. But it feels right, doesn't it? Using this money to give people the chances I never had." As their work gained recognition, Jake found himself in the public eye, but for reasons he could be proud of. Media outlets hailed him as a philanthropist, a far cry from the shadowy reputation his family once held. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Jake faced resistance from some quarters, including former business associates of his family, who saw his actions as a threat to their own interests. There were attempts to discredit him, to paint his efforts as a publicity stunt or a way to assuage his guilt. Through it all, Jake remained steadfast in his mission. He weathered the storms of public opinion, kept his focus on the people he was trying to help, and slowly but surely began to see real change happening in his community. 1 year after his confrontation with his family, Jake stood on a podium at the grand opening of a new community center, the largest project his organization had undertaken yet. As he looked out at the crowd, a mix of donors, community members, and people whose lives had been touched by their work, he felt a surge of emotion. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "I was lost. I had money, but no purpose. I had a family, but no real connections." He paused, his eyes finding Carlos in the crowd, then Emily, who stood off to the side, a proud smile on her face. "Today I stand before you not as a wealthy heir, not as a member of a powerful family, but as someone who has found his true calling. This center, and all the work we do, is about second chances. It's about believing that no matter where you come from or what you've been through, you deserve the opportunity to build a better life." As applause erupted from the crowd, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had taken the dark legacy of his family and transformed it into something positive. He had found a way to help those who, like him, had once been cast aside by society. Later that evening, as Jake and Carlos walked through the quiet halls of the new center, Carlos turned to his friend. "You did it, Jake. You really did it." Jake shook his head, smiling. "We did it, Carlos. I couldn't have done any of this without you." As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Jake looked up at the stars, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this point. From a homeless man digging through trash to a beacon of hope for his community, he had come full circle. The path ahead was still long, with many challenges to face and much work to be done. But Jake was ready for it. He had found his purpose, his place in the world, and he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with the strength of his convictions and the support of the family he had chosen for himself. As they walked down the street, Jake and Carlos began to discuss their next project, their voices filled with enthusiasm and hope for the future. The legacy Jake had inherited had been transformed. and the legacy he would leave behind was just beginning to take shape.